Hey folks, welcome back. Ora here. This video is a in-depth coverage of Destruction Warlocks in PvE. I have previously done a shorter video that I uploaded a week ago, but I have been asked through various channels to do a more in-depth one. So taking the feedback from that previous one, I'm going to put it into this video, so it is going to be a little bit longer, I'm afraid. But I will still try to get through everything as condensely as I can. I will also be discussing the changes to the Inferno talent that will be hitting us on the 19th/20th, depending on your regional reset. Or 21st if you're watching in that part of the world as well. So let's get into it, and hopefully this answers any further questions that you may have. But first, let's start with the Covenant. Moving on to the Covenants then, Destruction's in a really good spot in terms of our viability when it comes to using multiple Covenants. You have Night Fae, Necrolord and Kyrian, primarily from a raiding perspective, but from a Mythic Plus perspective, we then favour Night Fae, Necrolord and Venthyr. You could probably use Kyrian again in Mythic Plus if you need a dedicated Kyrian, but generally speaking you'll have the likes of the tanks, or you might have a Shami in your group that is running Vesper Totem, so you don't necessarily need to be running Kyrian in dungeons for specific buffs, although Feather Boy is best boy. But for now, let's get into the raiding Covenants of choice. So Night Fae, Soulbind of choice, primarily Dreamweaver, and this is because of the haste stamp provided when we soul rot. Now, I do have the tooltip for soul rot on screen for you to read at your leisure, so pause it, have a read for any of you newer Warlocks among us, but the main reason this is strong and why it synergizes with Destruction is in fact because of the legendary rather than the ability itself. The ability synergizes very, very well with Affliction, but we're after the legendary and the stat amplification it gives us during its use, so it becomes a bit of like a mini cooldown through your rotation, because haste and crit increase the rate at which we generate our embers. Sorry, not embers, soul shards. Embers is going way back in the day. Expansion brain is on the mind, but that increases our generation, which feeds into our rotation, which feeds into our forset once we have it, and we will discuss forset once we get to the gearing segment of this video. And Dreamweaver helps that further because of a trait within her Soulbind that gives us an additional 15% haste when we cast Soul Rot. So, assuming you hit the maximum number of 4 targets, and that's 20% haste and crit, and then you also get the additional 15% haste for standing in the Field of Blossoms. So that puts us at 35% haste and 20% crit free for 8 seconds every minute, which is huge when it comes to things like Rain of Fire, maintaining immolates, throwing out incinerates if you need to, and things like that. From a raiding perspective, this is also the case because it allows for faster Chaos Bolts and a progressively faster rotation on a minute, which means that if you're using a 2-minute trinket, for instance, again, something we will discuss later in this video, it enables you to have periods of small burst, big burst, essentially, almost like a cadence and a cycle to your rotation, which is fantastic. And one of the reasons why Dreamweaver is so powerful, especially if there are adds that you can cleave Soul Rot into. So if an ad spawns on a minute rotation, or you're about to get an additional mob, Prototype Pantheon is a fantastic example of this, or Vigilant Guardian, because there's always adds up in Mythic, you can cleave Soul Rot to get the maximum amount of damage. In the same vein, that cleaving also works to Kyrian's benefit, so we'll discuss that in a moment, but first, Necrolord. So on screen now you will see Necrolord, and Plague Deviser Marilith is our Soulbind of choice here. This particular Soulbind and Covenant in general is very much single target, with an emphasis more on adding execute damage because of the way that Decimating Bolt works paired with Shard of Annihilation. Decimating Bolt, again, tooltip is on screen for you if you want to take a slow read, but essentially casting it causes our next incinerates to do increased damage, and that increase in damage is dictated by the amount of health that the target is missing. So as you progressively get closer and closer to the execute phase, incinerates will start hitting more and more. It's not uncommon, especially during execute, for your incinerates to essentially hit as hard, if not harder, than your chaos bolts. Especially when you have Shard of Annihilation, because Decimating Bolts also increases the critical strike chance by 100% and its critical strike damage by 50% for these buffed incinerates. So you have that, so Plague Divisor Marilith becomes even stronger, because his final trait, Kevin's Oozling, is when you use your ability, when you use Decimating Bolt, you summon Little Kevin, and Kevin then puts a debuff on the target, which causes that target to take 6% more damage from you. So you can kind of see where this is going. This is a very powerful single target emphasis on Conduit. So you can see this working very, very well in something like Top. Now, Top will kind of come under tips and tricks at the end of the video, because I have a little bit of advice for newer Warlocks that is going to make your healers absolutely love you in that dungeon, especially on Kultharok, commonly referred to as Lich Bitch. So yeah, stay tuned for that. It will be at the very end of the video. So there's not really a whole hell of a lot to say about the actual Soulbind itself. Once you decide that, you know, you're going Marilith and you want the Capstone trait, you're going to pick up your 3 potency conduits, and as you can see, the Covenant, or the conduits of choice that you use at Destruction Warlock, which you might have noticed coming from Dreamweaver to this, there's not really a lot of change. So let's get into Kyrian, cover the Mythic Plus choices and Soulbinds and kind of discuss there, and then we will discuss the conduits that you're picking and why you pick them. So, on to Kyrian. Unfortunately, I've been a bit of a bad Warlock at this point. I'm actually still working on Kyrian, hence the Soulbind pictures that you can see above me are not complete. I am working on them, and why the Languishing Soul Detritus Legendary itself says you have not collected this memory. Because I've been a bit of a moron and I slept on Kyrian. It is now coming to bite me in the rear, and the reason for that is because of how Scouring Tithe works in relation to some of the fights for destruction going into Mythic Sepulchre of the First Ones. So, for those of you that don't know, and those of you like me that might have been sleeping on this a little, Scouring Tithe deals arcane damage instantly, applies an 18-second dot to the target, and if the enemy dies while afflicted by Scouring Tithe, you generate 5 soul shards. If they survive, Scouring Tithe's cooldown is refreshed. Which, extra shard generation, great. Not something we really need for AoE fights, especially with Inferno, although I will discuss the changes to that talent once we get to the talent section. And it's like, well, we kind of have enough shards. We don't really need it. The strength, however, comes in the double legendary and the fact that the legendary itself, when Scouring Tithe generates soul shards, gain 100% increased movement speed and 45% increased critical strike chance for 8 seconds. If Scouring Tithe expires, gain 33% movement speed and 15% increased critical strike chance instead. Now, being able to reset Scouring Tithe, or the fact that if something just lives longer than the 18 seconds you get it back again, that means you have, or you can frequently get increased crit, which means a greater chance to crit on all of our abilities. But also bear in mind that when we crit on something like an Incinerate, we generate double shard fragments, which means that we can then just cast more and more and more, especially with things like Chaos Bolts, which, when you have your Forset, feeds into this feedback loop of having better eradication uptime and stuff like that. So it's definitely been a slept on Covenant, and the reason there are 2 options above us is because you can either go for 3 potencies and use the Covenant Soulbind that improves Scouring Tithe. Yes, kind of the theme here is you use your Infernal Soulbind, you use Ashen Remains to increase Chaos Bolt damage, and then you use your Soulbind conduit, essentially, to buff your Soulbind ability. But you can either go for the 3rd potency or using Mechanicos, you can use the Hammer of Genesis, which means that when you hit a new target, you gain haste. And in situations like Vigilant Guardians, for instance, when there are constantly multiple new adds spawning at any given time, with the right level of cadence, you can probably, or very nearly, maintain a full 5 stacks of that throughout the course of a fight, especially if you're clever about when you attack things. So maybe a well-placed rain of fire or something like that, and then just literally conflagrating something quickly as soon as it becomes targetable, especially towards the end of the fight. But all in all, Kyrian is proving to be a very, very strong contender on fights where there is a consistent chance to proc Languishing Soul Detritus. You'll also see it in heroic logs for fights like Rygalon during the raid, both in normal and heroic, when you have the orbs spawning and you can make use of those dying very, very quickly. But finally, we get to cover Mythic Plus, and as a result, Venthyr. I would also like to point out at this stage that the previous mentions for the likes of Necrolord and or Dreamweaver, Nightfey, they don't change. They don't change coming from raiding to Mythic Plus. But Venthyr is specifically more Mythic Plus focused, so let's discuss that. And finally we are on to Venthyr, the Mythic Plus Covenant option. And the reason, firstly, Soulbind of choice. Theatar is my preferred, primarily because you get access to his tea, and you also have Tubbins and Grubbins, who are the best pair, but also, interesting side note with Tubbins and Grubbies, they give Mastery. Now, for those of you that aren't 100% sure how Destruction Mastery works, it is both a damage increase and also a damage reduction, which means that, especially in my personal opinion, as you're pushing higher keys, as long as you can stay within Tubbins and Grubbins' little shade area, you also get damage reduction. There is also the option within the Soulbind as well. At the bottom you see I go right, that is for speed and avoidance when eating. If you actually go down the left path, being in Tubbins and Grubbins' shade actually gives you a damage reduction on top of that. So I feel Theatar is a lot better. Nadia has her place, especially with the fact that she will give you haste, and that'll convert into crit and whatever else through Thrill of the Hunt, not Thrill of the Hunt, Thrill Seeker. But I feel like that isn't as beneficial, especially as you're pushing higher keys. You also don't always know when it's going to proc. It's quite hard to gauge. At least with Tubbins and Grubbins, I usually have at least one proc per pack, sometimes two, which is just kind of easier to play around for the most part. And access to extra 3% of a stat through Theatar's T option is also very, very good. Now, on to Impending Catastrophe and the Legendary as well. There is a rather large debate within Destruction Warlock circles about which is better, Nightfey or Venthyr. Now, the reason for this is Impending Catastrophe is a very, very strong dot. It's a minute cooldown, 1.5 second cast time, and you basically create a ball of malice, let's just call it that, and you send it to hit a target, and then it will smart curse using your Curse of Weakness or Curse of Tongues to everything around it, which is, from a utility perspective for tanks, fantastic. It also does a considerable amount of damage, let's not forget. For those of you that may or not know, it actually got nerfed. The Legendary in particular actually got capped a while back during Sanctum of Domination in the previous raid tier, thanks to Rextroy, because he showed just how strong this can get. Because the Dotter component, when paired with the Legendary, Impending Catastrophe's damage over time is increased by 125%, plus 15% for each enemy target hit on the way to its final target, up to a maximum of 275%. That's the bit that's capped. And this is passing through targets. But you don't need to worry about positioning either, because this thing does enough damage that just using it normally means that over the course of a dungeon, like say Halls of Atonement or Sanguine Depths, or hell, even something like Mist of Sin Scythe, it Impending Catastrophe will be your... well, it will either be somewhere between your first and fourth most damaging ability over the course of an entire dungeon. That's taking into account, like me playing, I have the Forset, I have my Infernals, I am doing work with Rain of Fire and things like that, and Impending Catastrophe will still be within my top 3 most damaging abilities over the course of a dungeon. It hits hard. But then when you take into account that it throws out Curse of Weakness on melee targets, which means that they're attacking 20% slower to your tank, or Curse of Tongues on caster mobs, which means they're casting 20% slower, which, when you consider that you might have a ranged group, and our kicks aren't necessarily the best, Halls of Atonement, fantastic example of this. You need ranged kicks frequently in order to pull mobs in so that tanks can create death balls. For those of you that aren't aware, death balls are essentially when tanks get a lot of mobs, clump them up together, and they're within Rain of Fire radius, essentially, or Death and Decay, yeah, like clumped AoE packs, commonly referred to as death balls. But for us, we don't have a quick kick. We have 24 seconds. On our Fell Hunter, we could arguably Mortal Coil something in, but that's assuming it doesn't run in the opposite direction and go behind us. But with the current meta the way it is, you also have the likes of Marksman Hunters, or like, if you're lucky you'll have a Survival Hunter. Their kick's slightly shorter, but generally ranged DPS have a 24-second kick unless you're Demonology, where it's 30. And in being able to slow cast times down, you're affording your group that little bit of extra time to get kicks back off cooldown, to be able to get stuns out if you need them, or other forms of CC to try and prevent dangerous spells from getting cast. And so the utility benefit of Impending Catastrophe is huge. Unfortunately, we don't have that same level of stat amp every minute that we get from the likes of Dreamweaver, because Dreamweaver makes our rotation feel a lot faster, especially when we're going into that minute. Now, the reason... I can hear some of you already going, yeah, but utility, is it good, is it bad? It depends on how your tank is. The utility becomes a lot better for tanks when they start getting comfortable enough where they want to stand still. Because if they can stand still and they start having the ability to just tank, static tanking rather than kiting like you'd see in Monks and Demon Hunters, where their best form of defense is actually just getting the hell out of dodge, at which point we might want to use Curse of Exhaustion, which is a snare, or a slow. Obviously that's rendered useless if you're running with a Frost Mage, but that's by the by. This will help them do so. Like, my Monk absolutely loves it when I can just put 30 Murlocs in the first part of Gambit, or Tazavesh Gambit. If I can just make 30 Murlocs immediately start hitting 20% slower. Because that smooths out his damage drastically and is noticeable. Same with a bunch of casters. Whereas, once we start getting into like the Legendries and we start talking about Wilfrids and I discuss how strong that is, bearing in mind you can get your Infernal in some packs to a minute cooldown, having that pair up with Dreamweaver looks a lot more enticing and gives you a lot more burst damage, essentially, versus Impending Catastrophe's kind of rot dot damage, where it kind of looks more backloaded, where you don't necessarily feel it as you're playing it, but then you'll look at the end of the dungeon and go, damn! So, my personal preference is playing Destruction Venthyr, purely because I like being a utility player, and that utility, again, will come back to tips and tricks later in the video. But now we've discussed all the Soulbinds and Covenant choices, let's quickly talk about the conduits. And now on screen you will see the Soulbind, or the conduit. Infernal Brand, as you can see on screen, is for when you have the Forset. Once that, if you don't have the Forset and you're playing Destruction, not recommended, but if you want to play without the Forset, then swap Infernal Brand for Combusting Engine, which basically just amplifies your Immolate dot when you conflagurate, which feeds into the Roaring Blaze build, which we will discuss in a moment. But Ashen Remains, flat percentage increase it to your Incinerate and Chaos bolts as long as the target has Immolate on, which it will, as we will discuss in the rotational guide. Infernal Brand aligns with your Infernals. Your Infernals Immolation Aura now causes targets to take more damage from your Immolate and becomes really, really strong once paired with Reign of Chaos, and you're just stacking and stacking and stacking these. Then you have the Covenant-specific Conduit, which buffs the relevant Soulbind. Now, for Venthir, Necrolord, and Nightfey, kind of makes sense. The Kyrian one is, as previously discussed when we discussed the option, you have the choice of either using this or Hammer of Genesis. Now, for something like Vigilant Guardian, you might want to use Hammer of Genesis, but for Desauge, or Sausage Boy, however you want to use him, because that only spawns the one ad that dies relatively quickly and frequently, using Soul Tithe for that fight will enable you to get the most benefit out of your Chaos Bolts, because you got to remember, once that target dies, it then becomes a single fight again for a period of time, which means that you're getting increased damage out on your Chaos Bolts. And this is kind of where you get to play around with things a little bit. But for the most part, these conduits on screen are your bread and butter for the spec once you have your 4 set. Now, onto the talents. So, underneath on the left hand side of your screen, you have the talents set up for no tier at all, or essentially no 4 set. And on the bottom right hand side of the screen, you have the setup for once you have your 4 set. So, starting with no tier, you have Flashover, Reverse Entropy, Dark Pact, Cataclysm, Mortal Coil, Roaring Blaze, and Dark Soul Instability. This setup is your old Roaring Blaze setup. Some of you older Warlocks might be familiar with it from Sanctum of Domination, our previous raid tier, where we ran Cinders. Again, something we will discuss in the Legendary section. But this build revolves around buffing your fire damage, your Immolate, your Incinerate, and this is where you would be using your Combustion Engine conduit rather than Infernal Brand if you were to be playing this setup. Going to the changes on the right hand side of the screen though, you have Eradication, Reverse Entropy, Dark Pact, Cataclysm, Mortal Coil, Reign of Chaos, and Soul Conduit. Now, why those changes? Well, Eradication and Soul Conduit paired with Reign of Chaos kind of become a result of the 4-piece turning you more into a Soul Shard spending turret, essentially. Once you... because the idea behind Dark Soul Instability is you're kind of like rolling cooldowns, you've got your 2 minute, your 3 minute, and you're kind of playing around with things. But with the access to the 4 set and the fact you can spawn Infernals, or Blasphemy Infernals as they're called through the 4 set, those Infernals will cause Reign of Chaos to become a thing if you're talented, and Reign of Chaos gives you a 15% chance per Soul Shard spent to summon another Infernal, which further increases our Soul Shard generation through Immolation Aura on our Infernals. And in doing so, we end up in this situation where we can end up with more shards than we can physically spend. At which point, Eradication becomes really appealing over Flashover because you're able to maintain that up in a raiding environment, and even in just like in a boss situation going through a dungeon, like you can keep Eradication on single target encounters, no problem. And it kind of helps where Destruction's lacking a little bit because we don't quite have the single target we need in comparison to, say, Demonology Warlocks. And Soul Conduit has a chance to refund our shards, so we can kind of feed back into that. You can come out of Soul Conduit if you really want to for Dark Soul Instability, but we kind of cover that in the AoE section, which we will do in a moment. But generally speaking, this is how your single target talent setup is going to look. You can change Dark Pact and Burning Rush in both cases, and in my personal opinion, that change boils down to what Covenant you are running. Like, for instance, if you're running Nightfey, you're probably going to want Dark Pact, because the movement speed that we're given by Soul Shape, being able to blink around on a 2-minute cooldown, paired with our demonic circles and our demonic gateway, a little bit of pre-planning, we don't really need the movement speed granted to us by Burning Rush. Alternatively, if we're something like Necrolord, which has access to a huge defensive in Fleshcraft, but doesn't have the snap mobility afforded to us by Soul Shape, you might want to drop Dark Pact for Burning Rush instead on fights where you need to quickly readjust. Skolex being a really, really good example of just having to get out of dodge. Like, for a Night Fae Warlock, you can Demonic Gateway, Demonic Circle back to where you started. This is the heroic mechanic rather than mythic. And then on the next Wretch, when everyone's stacking up, you can literally Soul Shape blink to where you need to be. And once you're all knocked back and you reset to your next phase, where you're creating this triangle, you literally put down your circle and your gateway again, and you literally bounce back and forwards to the point where outside of a global, you don't really have to move. But if you're playing, say, Necrolord, because again, Skolex is actually a really good Necrolord fight. It is pure single target. There is nothing to cleave off throughout the entire fight at all. You might want Burning Rush to help you move quicker because you don't have access to that Soul Shape when you need it on like that third Wretch, essentially. So onto the AoE then. Now, the AoE talents, as you can see on the screen now, are much more solidified, essentially, in that the only change is from Cataclysm to Inferno. Now, for those of you that are watching this before the 19th, yes, I'm aware of the changes that are incoming, and for those of you watching it after the 19th, 20th, or the next reset, essentially, with the Inferno nerf, as things currently stand, it is not really a nerf. It just increases the point at which it becomes harder for us to physically be unable to spend our shards at any given moment. Now, as things currently stand, Inferno is worth spending on 2 targets anyway, as long as there's not like a priority mob that needs killing. So you Havoc to increase your shard generation, essentially. Obviously, if there's a priority target, Chaos Bolt it. Like if is up and you need to smack it because your tank is getting clobbered, Chaos Bolt. Don't just pad Rain of Fires. But Inferno itself, once you hit that like 5 target mark anyway, we are getting enough out that it's not that concerning. There is the potential that once this video, between this video being released and X, when I do a redo of this, if need be, that Inferno could get nerfed into the ground even further, to the point where it just doesn't generate shards past a certain point. Then we may see the likes of Fire and Brimstone, which causes our AoE Incinerates to become an option, because you can pair that with a legendary Diabolic Raiment, which basically doubles the shard fragments generated by Incinerate. Pairs really, really well with Fire and Brimstone. Again, if you guys want to see a video of that, just let me know, and I will show you just how degenerate that build looks, because one Incinerate will just fill your entire bar up. But the other change for AoE that you can do is coming out of Soul Conduit and going into Dark Soul Instability. This kind of gives you a 2-minute big Inferno window, especially when you consider that you have reducing its cooldown, and you're also likely to be running Wilfrids in Mythic Plus. And I'll be showing you guys a video about kind of how Wilfrids works when we get to the rotation section as well, because it's a really strong example, in my opinion, at my current play level anyway. So that's kind of where we're looking at in terms of the talents, and Inferno is still the go-to pick. Don't worry too much about the nerf, it is more about shard generation and not damage, and even then, as things currently look, it's not too concerning. Obviously, if we do get hit with more nerf bats, I will revise this particular segment, either in a pinned comment or in its own video. But for now, we've done talents, and let's get on to the gear. So onto the gearing then. On screen you will see the Warlock raid gear transitioning into the Warlock dungeon gear, and then you'll see it move on to the trinkets. If you want to pause during the raid gear or dungeon gear segments, feel free to do so, but these are just generic lists. The dungeon gear specifically can and will change depending on what other pieces you get, but from the raid gear itself you will see that a lot of our gear drops from the final 3 raid bosses within the raid, and that is partially due to the fact that it is a higher item level, therefore it has more intellect and better or more stats, which is kind of more important than actually better stats. And you'll see that where gloves are, rather than having the tier glove specifically, I actually have the gloves from the jailer, and this is because with the creation catalyst being a thing now, we can convert gear into tier pieces and they retain their item level and have pre-designated stats that they will then move to. So if something isn't particularly well statted but is a very, very high item level, it is worth converting that into tier gear. We do also run the problem with destruction where one of our legendaries, especially one of our raiding legendaries, it can only go on a tier slot, which is a little bit rough, but we'll discuss that section once, or discuss that legendary in particular once we get to that section. The trinkets though is really where the gearing becomes quite important, because we have a selection of trinkets, and I've put 6 on the screen, and these are kind of the 6 I'd recommend. You have 2 from the raid, both the drop from the same boss, Prototype Pantheon. So if you can get that on farm, I'd recommend it, because you do want a first sigil and an LED of the Eternals. That is also a plan B though, because in an IQD or an inscrutable quantum device, Soul-Letting Ruby, Solaria's Secret Technique, and Unbound Changeling, these drop from top left down and round. You have the other side, Theatre of Pain, Solaria's Gambit, which is the upper half of Tezavesh, and Unbound Changeling is from Mists, which I'm sure you all know. Now, Solaria's Technique and Unbound Changeling are both passives. This is really, really good if you're playing a really fast destruction build and you can get your Infernal back frequently. Soul-Letting Ruby and IQD both line up better if your Tyrant, sorry. I was thinking 90-second cooldowns, because you can get your Infernal to roughly a 90-second cooldown with Wilfred's quite often, which means that you can then line it up with every other IQD, as you would a Tyrant, or Soul-Letting Ruby if you're getting your Infernal down to roughly 2 minutes. The extra crit generated can be quite helpful in maintaining damage across the board, but once you start getting very, very fast Infernal cooldowns, essentially, you can get to a stage where running the double stats, so Solaria's Technique allows you to pick your highest, or a player's highest stat, so you can fish for crit, mastery, verse, depending on who you play with. You then get that stat, and granting the other player some of their highest stat, which is quite nice because that is a passive increase over the course of a dungeon. You do have to remember to refresh it every 30 minutes, but it does persist through death, so you don't need to worry about having to reset it every time you die. And then Unbound Changeling, you see on my tooltip, it's crit. This is because it was crit when I screenshot it, but the benefit of Unbound Changeling is if you eat a mastery food, Unbound Changeling will change to mastery, but it does also have the chance to change itself once per day to a version of itself where it gives all secondary stats. It doesn't give as much, it gives about half, I believe, but it gives all of them. So you'll get haste, verse, crit, and mastery. You'll just get all of the base secondary stats on proc, and that is by far, I think that is actually the second strongest trinket off the top of my head for destruction, followed by IQD, because IQD lines up so well with a baseline Infernal. So for raiding purposes, for instance, having a IQD and an unbound changeling would be fantastic. The reason for that is because in a raiding setting, outside of a couple of fights, destruction does not use Wilfrids. So your Infernal will always be a 3-minute cooldown, which lines up with IQD. And then if you have a changeling proc, at any point, you can just make use of it as you're throwing out free Infernals or doing whatever else you need. So all in all, these trinkets will set you by. There is also, like if you're going to multi-discipline as Warlock, it's also probably worth getting infinitely divisible ooze from Plaguefall, but that is more of a demonology trinket. If you want to know a little bit more about that, please do go see my other guide. But with gear out of the way, let's move on to the Legendries. Now, moving on to the Legendries, then on screen you will see the Cinders of the Ajikir, the Madness of Ajikir, and on the right hand side of the screen above my head you will see Wilfrid's Sigil of Superior Summoning, the Destruction variant with Infernal being reduced by 1.5 seconds. Now, Wilfrid's is our go-to AoE/cleave legendary. You will use it in Mythic Plus, and you will use it on some heavy cleave fights. Vigilant Guardian being a fantastic example from a raiding perspective, due to the rate at which you spend shards on things like Rain of Fire. For single target, however, the Cinders of the Ajikir and Madness of Ajikir are interchangeable based on whether or not you have the Forset or not. Remember how I was saying earlier in the talent section, and also partially in the Soul Conduit section, that you'd be running Roaring Blaze? Well, Roaring Blaze, if you don't have the Forset, pairs very, very well with Cinders of the Ajikir, because it gives Conflagurate that one additional charge and reduces its cooldown, or its recharge time, by 3 seconds. This means that you can keep Roaring Blaze on the target for a lot more, and on top of that, because you're using the Combusting Engine conduit, it means that you can pump 2 Conflagurates into an Immolate, buffing its remaining dot damage drastically, and not be punished for it long term, because you can still cycle through everything. Now, once you get the Forset and you become a shard spending turret, the Madness of the Ajikir becomes a lot better. This also goes back to what I was discussing about the Kyrians and certain fights allowing you to use Soul Tithe as a conduit, because remember how Soul Tithe as a conduit buffed the damage the Chaos Bolt did? Well, once you have the Forset and you're leaning into it, Madness of the Ajikir further buffs Chaos Bolt damage. But the way it does it is that every consecutive Chaos Bolt cast will be buffed, because Chaos Bolt increases the damage of your Chaos Bolt by 25% and reduces its cast down by 20% for 4 seconds. This is almost like a pseudo backdraft for conflagurating, because when you conflagurate you get backdraft, and backdraft then increases the cast time of either your Incinerate or Chaos Bolt. Now, generally you want to use those backdraft charges on Chaos Bolt, but sometimes it can't be helped because you're running low on shards. The thing to bear in mind though with Madness is you do not want to try and keep it up all the time. Its buff is great, yes, but your main concern is keeping Eradication on the target at all times. And as we kind of get into the rotation section that we'll be covering shortly, after we watch a small video, because the video I'm going to show you guys kind of links quite well into both this section and the rotational section, you'll kind of see where things go in terms of Eradication versus maintaining the Madness buff. But these are kind of your bread and butter legendaries that you'll get used to playing. There is the Diabolic Raiment legendary that I previously mentioned. I'm not going to show the tooltip here because it's not currently an optimal legendary. It's more of a flavorful legendary that you can play around with, and if you want me to demonstrate that and Fire and Brimstone, again, please do comment below and I will get a dedicated video out for that and maybe compare that against Inferno across larger targets, so we can have a play around that. But this is kind of your legendary, or your legendaries of choice. And if you want a little bit more about that, feel free to ask me below. But let's get into the video and the rotational side of things, because I don't really think there's much more I can add to this section. So this particular video that you're about to watch is a 17 Mists of Tin scythe that I plugged with a few friends, and I'm not really going to talk much. I'm just going to let you guys watch the video, but do bear in mind how I maintain immolate. I use Rain of Fires, and even without the use of Inferno during the middle pack, I'm still able to do good levels of DPS. It's around 20k, could be better, but still. But you'll see that there is only a pack in between me using Infernal and it being ready again, and this is kind of the power of Wilfred's. So again, I'll just sit back, let you guys watch this video, and then we'll discuss the rotation properly afterwards. Right, now we've watched that video, hopefully that has given you some idea as to the strengths of Destruction AoE. Let's go into the rotation and the single target rotation primarily, because the AoE is much easier in terms of kind of how you think about things. So the opener is you precast Incinerate, roughly 3 seconds on the timer. You apply Immolate if you are single target, or you are spec'd into raid. You will obviously be running Cataclysm, so apply Immolate through Cataclysm, cast your Conflagrate, cast Summon Infernal. If you're about to cap on shards, which you may do at this point, cast Chaos Bolt. You then use your Covenant spell, i.e. Soul Rot, Decimating Bolt, whatever it is, and then follow your quote-unquote normal rotation. Now, the reason rotation on the screen is in apostrophes is because Destruction doesn't really have a set rotation. Like, you're not going 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 5, 8, or whatever your keybinds may be. It's actually more of a common logic or common sense approach to a rotation. You don't want to cap out your 5 shards, so you spend, when you're approaching 5 shards, you have Eradication, so you want to maintain Eradication, which means that if Eradication has, say, 3 seconds left on its timer, you're at 4 shards, and Chaos Bolt needs to get to your target, guess what spell you're casting next? And you use Incinerate and Conflagrate to generate your shards, ideally spending the backdraft charges generated on Chaos Bolts, but again, sometimes that isn't always the case, because you need to Incinerate or you physically can't afford to Chaos Bolt. And that's why something like the Madness of Ajakir kind of makes its benefit known, in that your second Chaos Bolt within 4 seconds is essentially going to have that backdraft. Now, the AoE side of things, I won't put on the screen in writing. If you want me to type it up as a comment below, I will do. But generally, in AoE, it's very much the same. You want to maintain your immolate on your target for up to 8 targets, assuming they are going to live longer than about 6 to 10 seconds. Because if they're not going to live that long, it is not worth casting immolate out on these targets. So you maintain immolate on up to 8 targets. You make sure you don't cap out on shards. Now, self-criticism for the video you watched, there were points where I capped out on shards and should have reacted a little bit faster. Because that is the key point in our AoE situation. We are going, and there will come a point where you get that much shard regeneration that you physically can't spend it. Which is why Inferno is getting nerfed. Now, it's getting nerfed to a degree that we will still generate those shards, but the rate at which we hit that infinite shard spending cap, essentially, is now much greater. We're going to need packs of like 30 or 40 mobs, potentially, to reach the same point that we're hitting on, say, 12 mobs. So, hopefully it means that we have a little bit more of a rotation, and we're not going to get carpal tunnel syndrome from spamming Rain of Fire, but the AoE situation is a lot easier, especially once you have the 4-piece. Hopefully this section talking about rotation has helped you. If you want me to elaborate any further, please comment below. But for now, let's get into the tips and tricks and wrap this video up, because I appreciate it's been a long one. Finally, on to the tips and tricks then, and kind of how to make your healer love you, and just generally make things a little bit easier for your group. The first and foremost is making use of your pet utility. As you get used to playing Destruction, you will get used to being able to swap between your pets. Remember, we do have the ability to rapidly summon and change pets, and it is only on a 2-minute cooldown, being able to swap and change it as we do. So, fights within, say, Theatre of Pain, for instance, the boss fight called Warlock, usually it's the second boss most people go for Bloodlust timings, but it is the Lich looking individual. So you have once you go down Theatre of Pain after dealing with the contenders, you have Zav the Fallen in the red area, you have Gorchop in the Plague looking blighted region, and then where the platforms are and you play a little bit of hopscotch through portals, that is Kultharok, for those of you that don't know. Now, Kultharok's fight is quite difficult for healers, and as Warlock, you could keep your Fell Hunter out, and you could just go with the DPS, dealing with the mechanic. However, there is a debuff that's thrown out onto 2 targets during that fight, especially during tyrannical weeks. This becomes very, very scary for your healers. Your Imp can cleanse it, and your Imp is able to remove magic effects on you, or on your party members, which means that fight, if you coordinate with your healer, or even if you just instantly dispel yourself whenever it's on you, you will make the healer's life a lot easier, and they will love you for it. Partially because it drastically reduces the amount of healing that is required for that fight, while simultaneously it also allows them to DPS. My friend Time, who frequently heals, got very, very excited when he realized that I did top as a Destruction rather than Demonology, because it is a utility that Demonology Warlocks do not bring to the table, regardless of how much damage they bring. You cannot kill that boss fast enough to beat having an Imp. Alternatively, you also have things like your Mist Tin Scythe. Prior to the part of the video you saw, you can use your pets to pull things through the walls ahead of time. So if you're coming down after the Ingram Alec fight and waiting for Mistcaller to do her thing and move off, you can send your pet through the wall ahead of time. And again, just resummon it once it dies, and the mobs will come around. Again, once you communicate this with your tank will be ready to pick them up, and it can help with percentage, or if you need to go in that direction anyway, it can actually speed up getting through because you've already dealt with the packs simultaneously, especially on a week when trash is much, much easier to contend with. You then have a few choices where it comes to things like using Warlock Gateway and Warlock Skips. There have been a few changes. You can use it in places like the other side, as you're going to, say, the Ardenweald section, and if you're woe skipping or not, you can actually use it from the urn and then place it up and past the mobs up onto the stairs, and you can skip that way. It allows you to avoid certain packs. Obviously have a conversation with your tanks if this is something they want you to do, but you then also have the ability to use old skips essentially for things like Mist of Tainted Scythe. However, they have changed the way that the Mist of Tainted Scythe skip is done. If you Google onto YouTube, or if you want me to do it, show you myself, I can do, just comment below and I'll get a video out. But they have required you to actually jump slightly up the wall and try and get a higher elevation. I don't know why they did it, but it's still doable. And there's plenty of videos out there showing you how to do it. It just takes a little bit more practice, I'm afraid. Aside from that, though, Warlock skips, making sure you use your soul stones. Interesting point. If you're running with a marksman hunter on a high tyrannical key, coordinate with your group and give them a soul stone ahead of time. That could help them somewhat, because it allows them to take essentially a tactical death without the problem of then scrambling afterwards. Not always possible, but it's something you can coordinate with, because unlike druids and death knights that either have to swap their attention or have to waste a resource to resurrect, we can plan ahead of time. Obviously we can only do it to one target, so generally it's usually sat on a healer in case the healer, you know, bucks it, but it's something you can think about. The last final note on kind of tips and tricks is, if you're not going to be playing Venthyr Destruction, I would recommend getting acquainted with rapidly using various curses, especially things like Curse of Tongues or Curse of Weakness. You can use Curse of Exhaustion, which is a personal favourite of mine because we don't have reliable slows in my Mythic Plus group. We do have things like Binding Shot, but sometimes that takes a while to get down. And being able to scroll my mouse wheel down to immediately slow something is just a trait that I picked up when playing my Paladin with Hand of Hindrance and playing other classes that have spammable slows, like Chains of Ice if you're a Death Knight or things like that. Because it enables your tank to get out of dodge, or enables you to better clump things up as they're kiting. Because remember, even while they're being kited, if you slow them, they're going to spend longer in your rain of fires, especially if you pre-place them so they've got to run through the entire diameter of your rain of fire during larger pulls. That kind of technique is much better if you're running with, say, a Frost Mage, because Frost Mages naturally clump things up. But if that's the case, then you're probably going to be wanting to use Curse of Weakness and Curse of Tongues rather than Exhaustion, because their frost snares are better than your own. Hopefully this video has helped. Thank you very much for watching, and if you have any feedback for me at all, please do comment below, and I will catch you in the next one. Take it easy, folks, and have a good one.